Well, I have a confession to make. This is the best place to make it. I secretly love some country music. I love, of course, the old stuff, Hank Williams Sr., Ernest Tubb, Webb Pierce, that era. I don't love a whole lot of country music that Reba McEntire labels bro country, but there's one group, full confession, I own everything they have. They're called Little Big Town, and they are a 4-part harmony country group. Probably country pop would be more of a classification of the group. Their chief songwriter and producer, he's produced most of their albums, is actually a Christian named Wayne Kirkpatrick. For those of you that grew up in the 80s with Michael W. Smith and Amy Grant, Wayne Kirkpatrick wrote and produced all of their albums. So he comes out of the Christian scene. And there's one, I have so many favorite Little Big Town songs, but here goes one of my favorite. It's a song that Wayne Kirkpatrick actually wrote for them called Welcome to the Family. Anyone ever heard of Little Big Town's rendition of Welcome to the Family? Well, you're in for a treat. Welcome to the family. Hope you have a real good life with my little sister. Yeah, she'll make a real good wife. Hope you have lots of babies. Hope you get a real good job. Hope you don't mind company, because we'll be here a lot. And brother, here's some brotherly advice. If you know what's good for you, you'll treat her right, because Grandpa's the local sheriff. He's the judge and the jury too. Uncle Bill's the undertaker's son. He'll dig a hole for you. Cousin Jesse, he's just plumb crazy. He'll fight you just for fun. Mama's got a real bad temper. And Daddy's got a shotgun. Welcome to the family and this side of the tracks. If you ever leave her, you ain't coming back. My nephew Red's a hunter. He gonna hunt you down, just like he did the last one, and he still ain't been found. Now, I like you just fine, don't get me wrong, but boy, take care of her, because if you don't, Grandpa's the local sheriff. Yeah, he's the judge and jury too. Uncle Bill's the undertaker's son. He'll dig a hole for you. Cousin Jesse, he's just plumb crazy. He'll fight you just for fun. Mommy's got a real bad temper and Daddy's got a shotgun. Do you know this resemblance to your family? Well, if you don't, let's make introductions from last week's sermon of 2 Samuel chapter 13. David the king was a father to a son named Amnon and another son named Absalom. He also was a father to a daughter named Tamar and an uncle to a nephew named Jonadab. Amnon conspired with Jonadab, his cousin, to rape his sister Tamar, whose brother Absalom murdered Amnon over the debacle. Amnon was dead, Tamar's life was ruined, and Absalom was on the run. Welcome to the family. Today's story in 2 Samuel 14 continues with Absalom as the main character. He is estranged from his dad, King David, who has to be tricked into reconciling with his son by his nephew Joab, who would be Absalom's cousin. Welcome to the family. So to set the scene, you have Absalom, the spoiled brat, crown prince, who probably never was told no a day in his life, and if he was told no, it was never enforced, as all spoiled brats become spoiled brats by. They're entitled and believe the rules don't apply to them. Absalom, of course, thought this way. In his mind, David was a deadbeat dad, a do-nothinger, And if he wouldn't do anything in the case of Amnon's rape of his sister, surely David wasn't going to do anything if he killed Amnon. And he was right. Absalom, under God's law, should have been killed for murder, but he got off because his dad was a do-nothinger, which only empowered Absalom's entitlement all the more. And he became more and more of a spoiled brat. And he, as all kids do, resented his dad for this. For his part, David did not want Absalom around him. We don't know if it was embarrassment, if it was disappointment, if it was something else. And a lot of people would take verse 1 as quite the opposite. When they read this, they think, well, David did want Absalom around. The text says the king's heart was for Absalom, but this is highly interpretive, isn't it? It could mean that David's heart was for Absalom in love and affection, that he desired reconciliation, to which I ask, well, he's the king. If he wanted Absalom back, all he had to do was make an ordered decree and Absalom would have been back. So it's problematic that we take verse 1 to mean that David really, really, really wanted Absalom back, that there was nothing he could do. Everything in the text seems to actually go the opposite. We could easily interpret verse 1 to mean that the king's heart was for Absalom in that he was angered. He wanted Absalom to be punished, that he was outraged by his conduct. In fact, the text hints not once but twice that Joab tried to get David to take Absalom back on many occasions, but David wouldn't. It's why Joab had to trick David to do it, because he had asked David directly to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem and reconcile with him. David wouldn't, and so we have this trickery by Joab. If there's any unclarity about where David was at with Joab, verse 24 should bring the clarity we need. David says, "Let Absalom depart to his own house, but he is not to come into my presence." That doesn't sound to me like a dad that wants his kids around. So clearly David reciprocates Absalom's feelings. Absalom resents his dad, is a spoiled brat who doesn't feel the rules apply to him, and David reciprocates by not wanting his kid around. Now, I have heard parents in my life say something similar. I've heard them say perhaps their kids have gotten into trouble after trouble after trouble, that the parents have bailed them out of crime after crime after crime, money after money after money. They've lived with them. They haven't adhered to the rules, and so they just, for their own well-being, cannot be around their kids anymore. I cannot compute that. I love having my kids around me. My kids have been better kids to me than I've been a dad to them. And so to hear David talk this way is hard to comprehend. A parent saying, he is so jacked up, I don't want to be around him. He's made such a mess of things, I don't want to be around him. But that is the state. It's important you understand this relationship, otherwise the story isn't going to make any sense. So this story, Absalom is the headliner. Last week's message really was background to introduce this spoiled brat kid. This week he takes center stage again, and I'd like to ask three questions that I think the text would have us ask that denotes this characteristic of Absalom. The first question is this wisdom? That's the first scene of our story. Does divine wisdom look this way? You say, what way does it look? We have our first stage of the story. Here, the primary task of a king, if you'll recall, when God set up the kingdom, was to execute justice. In fact, the king of Israel had several nicknames. One of it was Supreme Justice of the Law. You could not go to any final court in Israel, earthly wise, except for the king of Israel. And each day he took several cases. Some were criminal, some were civil, but over and over again he takes these cases. You might recall Solomon would later ask God for wisdom on how to decide these cases. And so David was the one who, when he issued a decision as king, you couldn't appeal to a higher court. That was his job description. Sadly, he didn't enforce the law on his own kids. They were too good for God's word. And it nearly brought his kingdom down. The story takes place where Joab, the general of David's entire army, wants to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. The text never tells us why. We don't know why. Joab later in this chapter is going to turn on Absalom. In fact, here in a few chapters, Joab will be the one to kill Absalom. So the text doesn't tell us why. We can deduce that it had to do with national security. You know, Absalom is the crown prince, so he's next in line to the throne. Much like our country at all times wants to know where the president and the vice president are. Joab probably wanted Absalom close to Jerusalem in case Israel needed a new king. But that's even a guess. But Joab, because he's asked David many times to bring Absalom back home, and David has refused, Joab resorts to trickery. And what we have in the early portions of chapter 14 is Nathan 2.0. Joab contracts a woman from Tekoa, about 10 miles south of Jerusalem, who's a known actress. She is a thespian skills. She's fantastic at oratory. And Joab pays her off, writes the script that she is to perform, and goes to David's court. She, like Nathan before her, tells David a made-up story, a fictitious story, in order to tug at his heartstrings to implicate his own words against him. In both stories it works. Nathan the prophet and this woman from Tekoa. When she arrives at court to plead her case, she tells the story. She says that she had 2 sons. These 2 sons are out in the field, and they get into a spontaneous skirmish, an argument. One thing leads to another, and one of the sons takes an object, knocks the other son upside the head, and inadvertently kills him. There's no one out in that field to rescue him, and so the son dies. Her family then wants to try the other son for murder and have him executed under law. She comes to David and begs and pleads that she would restore her son back to the family, because if he does not, if the family has their way, that son will also be killed and she will be left without any heirs. So that when her husband dies, all of her property, all of her inheritance will resort back to the family, and she will not get anything. She'll be destitute and homeless. So her son is her lifeline, her security. But her family, she suspects, because of ulterior motives, wants him dead so that they can take the money. So she appeals to David that he would forgive the debt and reconcile the son back to the family. She gives 3 reasons why, and her reasons are extremely weak. But she has David. She tugs at his heartstrings and he agrees to do it and says, "You have my word. If you have any problem, just bring the family members back." And she says, "Your Majesty, you don't know how many family members I have. I have them by the dozens, by the hundreds. If they keep coming, they'll wear you out and you may not want to take the case." He just says, "Just send them in." And she says, "Well, if you just make an oath today that I have your royal decree I can take back to have this done. That will be enough. And he agrees. She then turns it back on him and says, well, why didn't you do the same thing to Absalom? He then, at that point, suspects Joab's fingerprints all over it. In fact, he asks her, did Joab put you up to this? And she says yes. But David, after giving his word, still continues and makes good on the case. And later, because of this, he then has Absalom come back to Jerusalem, which is exactly what Joab wanted. So to get back to my question, is this wisdom? Joab is a very cunning man to do this. He gets what he wants. One could argue that's wisdom, getting what you want and doing it through clever means. He certainly contracts one of the wisest women to do it. She has a reputation for wisdom and oratory, and because of her wise cunning, she had David come to this decision that we could argue is a wise thing to have your son. You shouldn't be mad at your son. You shouldn't have unforgiveness toward your son. You should want him back at family gatherings. But I ask again, is this divine wisdom? Let's analyze her argument and let's see its inconsistencies. I see at least three. First, the woman engaged in legal misdirection. She's trying to argue apples to apples, but it's actually a case of apples to oranges. By her own testimony, the one boy accidentally, inadvertently killed the other son. But in Absalom's case, it was a result of 3 years of premeditated, cold-blooded manslaughter. He had been waiting for this opportunity to kill Amnon. So her story doesn't parallel the events that David is dealing with. Second, she minimized Absalom's significant crime that under Deuteronomical law he should have been executed, and she did it with sentimental manipulation. This is what she says in verse 14. We all must die. We're all like water spilled on the ground which cannot be gathered up again. Look, king, we all die someday. Amnon's death had to happen. If it wasn't this day, it will be something else. It's tragic, it's unfortunate, but we all have it coming. So she's minimizing Absalom's crime under God's law that wasn't some sort of accident, twist of fate, providential. It was a cold-blooded act by a sinner. And yet she's asking David to treat it in a cavalier, sentimental way. The third problem is she has what I call a motto that I actually live my life, and it has liberated me, particularly in the days we're living in, and it's a motto that goes like this. Your fake crime, or your fake crime on your part, does not necessitate a faux apology on my part. And here's what I mean. Today, if you haven't noticed in our day, we are living where every other day people get their feelings hurt. They're offended by something. Whether it's in the public arena, in the social arena, even our kids, we're having to listen to them say that they got their feelings hurt because of something we said. Well, this is a clever way to shut down discussion, isn't it? If, for example, a woman comes up to me today and they're crying and they say, Brian, you offended me, then my first reaction is to get them to quit crying, so I say, I'm sorry, which then ends the discussion, right? And this is exactly what culture is doing. Now, I happen to believe that there will be overplay on this, but I don't get offended easy because I don't want to give people power over my life. And it's a sad day when every other brother is offended or their little feelings get hurt. And so my motto really lives in this case, that your fake crimes don't necessitate a faux apology on my part. I'm not going to apologize for something that is not my fault. You getting your feelings hurt is not my fault. It may be that you need to grow up. And this is exactly the logic this woman is playing. Here's what she says in verse 13. Why have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, insomuch as the king does not bring his banished home again. Here's what she's saying. Follow her logic. Because you won't bring Absalom back to Jerusalem and reconcile with him, you don't care about the nation of Israel. So her fake crime, right, Absalom, she's trying to get David to have a faux apology. When in reality, if David really cared about Israel, he would have executed Absalom for a violation of God's law. The fact that he has not brought Absalom home is not a crime on his part, but that's what she's trying to do, to bullpen him, to cajole him into a decision. So remember that motto. It will give you a lot of good sleeping nights, that fake crimes on someone else's part does not necessitate faux apologies on your part. Soon and very soon, every Christian in this room will be giving faux apologies for being a Christian because of fake crimes. But David relents and brings Absalom back to Jerusalem. Was this a wise decision, I ask again? Well, we see the results. Absalom is brought back to Jerusalem as the most popular figure in Israel, we'll soon learn. Everyone in Israel knows that it is him against his dad, and he is brought from Geshur, a remote place, to the capital city of all Israel, where thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people every day will walk by Absalom in his popularity and try cases before him because he says, my dad's too busy for you, and by the way, doesn't really like me anyway. I'm against the establishment. It is the colossal mistake to bring this firecracker back to Jerusalem. So in all of Joab's wisdom, he in effect brings the fox back in the henhouse. And it nearly destroys David's kingdom. David detects Joab's hand, but he still cannot deal with Absalom. He should have executed justice on Absalom. Ironically, in verse 32, David's own words suggest as much. But here we have a king who no longer acts. He is acted upon. In this chapter, David reacts rather than rules. He consents rather than reigns. He appears decisive, but he ultimately caves. This is not wisdom. Second question I would appeal to the text today is our story of providence. Now I want you to place yourself immediately after verse 33 and look back on the entire story from Absalom's point of view. David's kiss signifies Absalom's complete restoration to royal favor. What looked impossible 5 years before now is reality. Now Joab went to work on David. His plans seemed to work. Absalom's allowed back in Jerusalem. He has no punishment whatsoever for his murder. And even though David threatens to stiff-arm him, then a peculiar incident happens in which the storyteller again leaves out the details. But apparently, after some time in our story, Joab got wore out with Absalom. We're not told why. I would love to know why. The very man who brought you back in the fold, this spoiled brat war against. And by the way, very few people want to be around spoiled brats for very long. And evidently, Joab could have all he could take of Absalom, and he got wore out with them. This is prior. He's back in Jerusalem, but David didn't want him in his house. So it's during that time. Absalom really wants to be back in David's house. Remember, he's an entitled brat. So if he wants it, he gets it. No one's going to say no. So he uses Joab to do it again. He sends him a text message, and Joab doesn't reply to his text messages. Right? If you've ever had that happen, you go bonkers. I know they're getting my text message. Why aren't they responding? Well, Absalom does this long enough, Joab doesn't reply, so Absalom, being the spoiled brat entitled, do what spoiled brat entitled, he gets his attention, so he burns down his entire barley field. You talk about entitled. You talk about ungrateful. This is the guy that brought you back to your dad. If he wouldn't have done this, you'd still be in the backwoods. And this is how you're going to treat him simply because he doesn't respond to your text messages? You better believe a spoiled brat will do that without a care in the world. In fact, he never apologized to Joab for burning down his property. Talk about an ungrateful idiot. He actually thinks that Joab owes him. So he says, now that I got your attention, forget the thousands of dollars Joab's out, a whole season of money. Now that I got your attention, I want you to get me back in my dad's Jerusalem palace. And so the meeting is arranged, and David kisses him and brings him back. I mean, Absalom should win Comeback of the Year award. Again, let's look at things from his viewpoint for a moment and ask yourself, is this providential? He liquidates his rapist brother, and he's reconciled back to the throne. And at the end of this chapter, he now stands next in line to get it without even a slap on his wrist. What he seemingly sacrificed forever is now completely restored to him. He's got to be thinking, well, you know what that it says, all things work together for good. So I've asked you to think from Absalom's point of view. Now, I am not suggesting this is a work of God that he's pleased with, only that it seems as such. Let me give you another one. It is July the 20th, 1944. The Nazi premier is in a rail car meeting with his close counselors. 30 minutes later, he will meet with Benito Mussolini about what their next move of World War II will do. And a briefcase is underneath the table that is a few feet away from Hitler. It is sat there by a saboteur that wants to assassinate him. A bomb is detonated, it goes off. An explosion happens, it completely blows up the rail car. Hitler is injured but survives. He loses a little bit of his feeling in his right arm. He never recovers. But the thing is blown to smithereens. And somehow he escapes within this thing a few feet. He meets with Mussolini 30 minutes later, and he shows them this rubble of a rail car that just a few moments he was in. And he says, do you understand what this means? And Mussolini's fearful. And, well, yeah, someone wants to kill you. He said, no. God is with me. I was just a few feet, I should be dead, but I know now that the Almighty's with my war effort. This is a man who's butchering Jews, but he believes honestly in providence because he escaped. Brothers and sisters, I don't have to tell you our crazy life in this world can give us fits of faith all day long. Here is a man, Absalom, driven by hate, guilty of murder, who has friends in high places and gall to force the issue. And what happens to him? He comes off scot-free. And if you and I did this, we'd be in prison the rest of our life. So it does appear from this chapter that evil men meet with success. They're approved of heaven. They're free from justice. Leukemia doesn't kill their kids. Cancer does not decimate their wives. Drunk drivers don't mangle their families. Downsizing doesn't eliminate their jobs. Hail doesn't ruin their crops. Is God smiling on them? Is this providential? Go home and eat lunch and worship on that. Third question. Is this leadership? This little peculiar odd section of verses 24, 25, and 26 is the third part of our three-part story, and it seems woefully out of place. In fact, you could patch verse 24 to verse 28 and never miss a beat. of the main drama of the story. And all it is telling us how good-looking Absalom is. It tells about his good looks, his hair care, and his family. Everything you really care to know, right? Here's Mr. Israel, the darling of the media, the choice of the paparazzi, enchanted with his own looks, with 3 gorgeous sons and 1 gorgeous daughter, appropriately named after her gorgeous aunt. Why is this here? And what does this tell us about leadership? Think back for a moment in our entire study of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Those of us who've been journeying through this book for the last year and a half, these 3 verses conjure up past ghosts of potential leaders that were long on image and short on substance. One can hardly read these verses and not hear the echo of Saul in 1 Samuel 9 that describe him as an impressive young man, a head taller than all the others. Or, without remembering Eliab, Jesse's oldest son, so gripped with good looks that Samuel nearly anointed him as the second Saul. Not that Yahweh looks on physical attractiveness or impressiveness as a disqualification, but physical presence before men without submission to God makes leadership a disaster. So when we read verses 25, 26, and 27, we should be uneasy because they do conjure up the ghost of Saul, with one exception. Saul the handsome in appearance was hesitant to take the throne. Absalom the handsome is not hesitant to take the throne. Puritan commentator Matthew Henry asks a great question here and an observation. Curiously, nothing is said in the text about Absalom's wisdom or piety. To which I ask, is this leadership? The answer to that question may be yes